Welcome back. Myself, MD Mahmoudul Hassan, Assistant Professor at Department of Geoinformation Science and Earth Observation, Patuakhali Science and Technology University, Bangladesh. In this video, we will talk about the barriers to climate change adaptation in cities and possible way forward. Before going to the details, first I would like to discuss about the concept of barriers to adaptation. Barrier to adaptation. There is really no agreed upon concept of barriers to adaptation, and most studies don't specify what they mean when they use the term of barriers. However, many scholars define barrier to adaptation by their own way. In 2010, Moser and Ekstrom defined barrier as constraints that can be overcome through concentrated effort, innovative management, a shift in mindset, prioritization, and related changes in resources, land use, organization, and so on. Isinak and Staker in 2012 defines barrier to adaptation as a series of circumstances that could obstruct the implementation of specific adaptations. Werik in 2016 defines barriers to adaptation as obstruction to specific adaptations for specific actors in their specific context that arise from climate and non-climate factors and conditions during the entire process of adaptation. Types of barriers to climate change adaptation in urban areas. Barrier to climate change adaptation in urban areas are categorized into 9 clusters by Werik in 2016. Werik proposed 9 fourth barriers on the basis of the framework of Moser and Ekstrom in 2010, and available other relevant literature suggests: number 1, conflicting time scale and conflict of interest. Number 2, leadership. Number 3, resources. Number 4, science. Number 5, governance and institutional constraints. Number 6, lack of awareness and communication. Number 7, attitude, values and motivations. Number 8, politics. And number 9, adaptation process. Conflicting time scales and conflict of interest. Conflicting time scale barriers to adaptation are linked with the short-termism in decision making, legislation, and election cycles, as well as the need to produce short-term outcomes. Despite the urgency of adaptation, conflicting timescale incorporating climate change issues into current and ongoing policy frameworks difficult. In comparison to the long-term effects of climate change, structural strategies often only prepare for the next 20 to 30 years. As a result, a short-term strategy can interfere with the need for long-term measures, such as long-term infrastructure improvements and future lack of consequences. Conflict of interest can emerge as a result of attempting to handle conflicting timescale, but it can also arise as a result of conflicting priorities and vision on how to adjust various climate change adaptation strategies. For example, developing an area for commercial or conservation purposes has different outcomes in terms of economic benefits as well as potential for exposure to disaster risk. Furthermore, conflict of interest may be also occur when financial and human capital are competing with other, more pressing priorities such as employment. Furthermore, the short-term outcome of these agendas could be more apparent than long-term climate change adaptation. Leadership. In urban areas, leadership is particularly critical for initiating adaptation process by fostering interest in adaptation, raising awareness. It is also crucial for pressing for systemic reform in governance structure so that action can be taken in a systematic manner that can sustain over the time. Leadership can be exercised by both individual and group of people or an organization. Local leadership is of course critical for the initial recognition, mainstream, future development, and long-term funding of adaptation at the local level and to create action space for other actors. On the other hand, lack of leadership, inefficient and dominating leadership, or so many leaders may hinder the climate risk assessment and overall adaptation process and keep people from actually participating in the process. Individual leaders, for example, can misuse their authority or weaken administrative agency collective ownership, making coordination of adaptation steps more difficult. Resources. Resources including human, financial, information, and technical resources are crucial factors throughout the entire process of climate change adaptation and are evidently key components for building adaptive capacity. However, information resources are discussed in the science or scientific understanding barriers. Resources are necessary at all stages of the strategic planning process and long-term distribution, particularly of financial resources. It's a message for leaders that such things need to be prioritized. Inefficient use of available resources and lack of resources including expertise, lack of staff, lack of managerial support, lack of or inadequate funding, high cost for implementing adaptation solutions, low returns on investment, lack of or inefficient technical adjustment. That is, a structural solution protecting the impacts of sea level rise, flooding, storm surge, etc. are defined as the key barriers to climate change adaptation. For example, cost of exploring and responding to climate change are found as major barrier to adaptation in Sydney. Science-related barriers. Science for scientific understanding may also be named as information barriers or knowledge barriers. They include uncertainty about scenarios, impacts, and risk outcomes, lack of information at a state, regional, and local level, lack of access to information, weak understanding or guidance on what to do with and how to understand the information, lack of adaptation knowledge, principles, and monitoring for success, lack of regional assessment, reliance on historical data, issues with information generation, interpretation and sharing, disconnect between information generation and requirement for use, that means policy and practice, lack of information standards for adaptation. Particularly, there are difficulties in coping with the underlying uncertainties in theoretical predictions on long-term climate change effects. This is particularly true for local governments, where the effects of climate change are yet to be felt and therefore remain theoretical and undefined. Furthermore, it is unclear at this point where we stand in terms of potential emission, that is, whether the average global surface temperature will increase by 2 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius. This type of uncertainty has a significant impact on the degree of adaptation needed. Governance and institutional constraints. Governance and institutional or policy barriers are most common barriers to implementing adaptation process. Any government mechanism that deals with a complicated policy issues is bound to be fragmented. Fragmentation occurs when agencies, organizations, persons, and strategies at various levels and scale fail to communicate and coordinate. That means lack of formal or informal processes to collaborate. Governance barriers or failures happen when systematic decision making and/or policy enforcement are found as inefficient. This shortcoming impaired adaptation by posing constraints while delaying planning and implementation. Governance failure are a serious concern in developed nations, becoming a barrier to fiscal planning and access to financial services. Governance-related barriers to climate change adaptation are lack of clarity surrounding roles and responsibilities for each level of governance, lack of governing leadership, competing demands across governance portfolios of sectors, etc. Institutional constraints, on the other hand, are associated with physical structures, laws, codes, and norms that govern behavior. Policy failure happen when regulations or policies create barriers to effective adaptation. These failures can occur when policy objectives are incompatible or competing, or when this is lack of consistency in the objectives, and there are no inadequate process to address the problem. Institutional or policy-related barriers to climate change adaptation are lack of clarity surrounding rules, public, private sector policy, regulation and control, mismatch between adaptation timelines and political terms, issues with regulation and standards across jurisdiction, issues associated with policy priorities and trade-off, legislation boundaries, inequality embedded in policies, lack of awareness and communication. It is crucial to explain the effect of climate change, response strategies, and their consequences to the general public, local governments, and other agencies during the adaptation process. The public, stakeholders, as well as other decision makers are left in the dark about their roles and adaptation activities, so far due to a lack of communication. Besides, lack of awareness is also a result of lack of communication. Insufficient or lack of communication regarding adaptation among the stakeholders can disrupt or influence social experiences with those participating in the process, leading to a lack of awareness. Hence, successful communication is necessary as it can raise knowledge and understanding by involving both policymakers, stakeholders, and the general public. Attitude, values, and motivations. Attitude, values, and motivation are the socio-cultural constraints for adapting to climate change. These constraints can also be explained as behavioral barriers. Deeply held characteristics, pre-existing values, customs, and views have a significant impact on the decision taken in the adaptation process. Moreover, societal, moral, religious, and cultural thoughts will shape individual and societal norms and rules. These include risk perception and the management and allocation of resources. These socio-cultural variables affect how people interpret risk, how they justify and think about climate change, what facts and experience they accept, what coping strategies they prefer, and fundamentally, why stakeholders choose to participate in adaptive behavior. Politics. Since a large number of strong forces are clustered in a small region, local metropolitan areas are especially vulnerable to political barriers to climate change adaptations. Furthermore, due to their technical actions in the different step of decision-making process, political actor can create strategic ambiguity. As a result, institutional constraints include issues over politicians, secret motives to perform on a specific adaptation, or their willingness as well as ability to act. Adaptation process. Barriers to climate change adaptation can also be associated with the vague adaptation process. Municipalities may need to guidance on where to start the adaptation or what specific steps to take. For example, different sorts of local adaptation approach not only create a scope but also allows actors to fight with interaction and implementation of the most appropriate and effective approach. When strategic long-term thinking and the broad perspectives are missing. Because of the ultimate context-specific aspect of climate adaptation, best practices are often used in the adaptation process, although their actual addition values is limited. Limited financial resources or different environmental laws can stem the one-to-one application of best practice. How to overcome adaptation barriers. Prioritization of certain strategies help to overcome a multitude of barriers such as attitude, lack of awareness, science or information barriers, conflicts of interest, resource barriers, and barriers related to institutions and politics. Early planning and preparation for future major risks can help to address policy challenges and information failures. Early activities such as research, monitoring, and piloting can offer information to improve future adaptation decisions and help to keep adaptation options available. Governance barriers, particularly fragmented relationship between local and national government, could be overcome through a multi-level governance framework. This framework must be prepared and implemented to ensure the process for proactive adaptation. To address many structural challenges, climate change adaptation must be integrated into ongoing systems, programs, and networks. The most effective factors for overcoming governance and institutional barriers include a small structural strategy, planning and management reforms, and attempt to climate internal governance system to provide a scope for continuing the climate change adaptation process. The most critical approach for addressing adaptation obstacles is to raise awareness among the mass population. Employees, department officials, and politicians through seminars, training, public panels, and activities. This type of approach makes people understand climate change and adaptation, and therefore recognize the necessity to being adaptive immediately. Furthermore, by discussing those techniques on a regular basis, actors ensure that adaptation is not overlooked in the existing workload, while still growing interest and appreciation for adaptation. Participation in research programs may also be an effective tool for raising knowledge among staff, the general public, and the policymakers. The recent focus on mainstreaming climate change adaptation can also help in overcoming certain governance and policy barriers. Rather than implementing stand-alone adaptation strategies, plans, or interventions, mainstreaming involves incorporating adaptation into current policies and decision making. For example, mainstreaming climate change into national and sector development strategies and plan as well as long-term vision documents is becoming increasingly important. Finally, effective adaptation can be achieved through continuous updating the adaptation strategies on the basis of regular monitoring and recent experience results. That's all for today. Thank you for watching this video.